Finally, they reached a maintenance hatch that led to the lower levels of the ship. The man pried it open with a grunt of effort, revealing a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. He turned to her, his expression serious. "This'll take us closer to the escape pods," he said. "You'll be safe once you're off this ship." "And what about you?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound composed. He hesitated for the briefest moment, then shrugged. "I'll manage." Something about his nonchalance unsettled her. He had risked so much to save her, yet he seemed ready to vanish as soon as the mission was complete. It didn't make sense, and it left her with a sinking feeling she couldn't explain. Before she could press him further, the sound of an explosion rocked the ship. The rebels had found one of his traps, and their shouts grew louder, more frantic. There was no time to argue. He helped her into the shaft, then followed close behind, his spear held at the ready. As they descended, the princess couldn't help but wonder what the Galactic Emperor would think of this moment. His daughter, the pride of the Empire, relying on a so-called primitive for her survival. It was almost laughable. But as the man led her through the darkness, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos, she began to see him in a different light. He wasn't primitive. He was a survivor, someone who had faced unimaginable odds and come out stronger. And in that moment, she realized she had underestimated the strength of humanity, the very people her empire had dismissed as weak and inconsequential. But this revelation brought no comfort, only more questions. Who was this man? What had driven him to this desolate place? And most importantly, what would happen when they finally escaped the ship? The answers seemed as distant as the stars, and for the first time in her life, the princess felt truly powerless. As they reached the bottom of the shaft, the man held up a hand, signaling her to stop. He peered into the darkness ahead, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of danger. The tension was palpable, and the princess felt her heart race as she waited for him to speak. Finally, he turned to her, his expression grim. "They're close. Stay behind me." She nodded, clutching the makeshift weapon he had given her, a jagged piece of metal that felt foreign and unwieldy in her hands. Together, they stepped into the unknown, their fates intertwined in a way neither of them could have predicted. And in the distance, the rebels closed in, their determination matched only by the secrets waiting to be uncovered. The galaxy's balance of power was shifting, and this unlikely alliance was at the heart of it all. The air was thick with the metallic tang of smoldering wires and burning fuel as the princess followed the man through the narrow, flickering corridors of the ruined ship. Every sound seemed magnified, the creak of their steps on the grated floor, the distant echoes of shouts, and the rhythmic hum of energy weapons charging somewhere behind them. She tried to focus on keeping her footing, on pushing the pain in her side to the back of her mind, but the questions swirling in her thoughts were relentless. Who was this man, really? How had he come to be here, on the fringes of the galaxy, in a place where no ordinary human should be? The Galactic Empire had long considered Earth and its scattered descendants an insignificant relic of a bygone era. After the planet's fall, millennia ago, the survivors were absorbed into the vast machinery of the Empire or left to fend for themselves on inhospitable worlds. Yet this man seemed untouched by any of that history. His defiance, his raw, almost primal determination, spoke of a different kind of survival, a life forged far from the Empire's reach. The princess's steps faltered as her mind raced to piece together his origins. Could he be from one of the forgotten colonies? A descendant of those who fled into the uncharted depths of space beyond the Empire's gaze? The idea was almost laughable. Such people were nothing more than myths, ghost stories told to frighten children. And yet, here he was, moving with a confidence and purpose that belied the Empire's assumption of human frailty. "Keep moving," the man growled, glancing back over his shoulder. His voice snapped her from her thoughts, and she realized she had fallen a few steps behind. He wasn't unkind, but there was an urgency to his tone that brooked no argument. She quickened her pace, clutching the jagged shard of metal he had given her as if it were a lifeline. As they pressed on, the ship's condition worsened. Panels hung loose from the walls, sparking intermittently, and the floor was littered with debris. The man moved through the wreckage with practiced ease, his spear held at the ready, while the princess struggled to keep up. Her breaths came in short, shallow gasps, each one a reminder of the injury she had sustained during the crash. She wanted to ask him how much farther they had to go, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she focused on placing one foot in front of the other, driven by sheer willpower. They came to a junction where the corridor split in two. The man paused, his sharp eyes scanning the area. He crouched low, pressing his ear to the floor as if listening for something. The princess watched him, a mixture of awe and frustration bubbling within her. He was unlike anyone she had ever encountered, and his methods, primitive as they seemed, were undeniably effective. "Left," he said after a moment, rising to his feet. "The escape pods should be this way." She followed without question, though doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind. Could they really make it out of this alive? The rebels were relentless, and the ship's structural integrity was deteriorating with each passing second. But the man moved with such unwavering determination that she couldn't help but cling to the hope he inspired. As they turned the corner, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, a maintenance bay, judging by the scattered tools and machinery. The room was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering sporadically, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. The man halted abruptly, his spear snapping up into a defensive position. The princess froze, her heart pounding as she strained to see what had caught his attention. From the darkness at the far end of the room, a low, guttural growl echoed, sending a chill down her spine. Her grip tightened on the shard of metal in her hand, though she doubted it would do much good against whatever was lurking in the shadows. The man stepped forward cautiously, his every movement deliberate and controlled. The growling grew louder, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against metal. "Stay behind me," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. She obeyed, her body trembling as she pressed herself against the wall. The tension in the air was palpable, and every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this place and never look back. But there was nowhere to go, no escape except forward. A pair of glowing amber eyes emerged from the darkness, followed by the hulking form of a creature unlike anything the princess had ever seen. Its body was sleek and muscular, covered in scales that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Razor-sharp claws extended from its hands, and its maw was filled with rows of jagged teeth. The creature snarled, its gaze fixed on the man as it advanced slowly, deliberately. The princess's breath hitched as she realized what it was: a hunter, one of the rebels' genetically engineered predators. These creatures were bred for one purpose: to track and eliminate targets with ruthless efficiency. She had heard stories of their ferocity, of how they could tear through entire squads of soldiers without breaking a sweat. And now, one of them stood between her and freedom. The man didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his spear held steady, his gaze locked on the creature. The princess could see the tension in his muscles, the way his fingers tightened around the weapon's shaft. He was calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. The creature lunged without warning, its claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. The man sidestepped the attack with agility that belied his size, driving the point of his spear toward the creature's flank. The weapon struck true, eliciting a roar of pain and fury from the beast. But it was far from finished. It turned on him with renewed ferocity, its movements a blur of claws and teeth. The princess watched in stunned silence as the man fought the creature, his every move a testament to his skill and resilience. He fought with a raw, unrelenting intensity, using his spear and the environment to keep the creature at bay. But it was clear the battle was taking its toll. The beast was fast, its attacks relentless, and the man was only human. Her hands trembled as she clutched the shard of metal, torn between fear and the desperate urge to help. She knew she was no match for the creature, yet the thought of standing by and doing nothing was unbearable. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, she stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "Behind you," she shouted as the creature feinted left, attempting to circle around the man. Her warning gave him just enough time to pivot and block the attack, his spear driving into the creature's shoulder. It howled in pain, thrashing wildly, but the man held his ground. The vast, star-speckled void of space was silent, as it always was. But on this day, in this distant corner of the galaxy, something extraordinary was unfolding. The air inside the crumbling metallic corridors of a derelict ship was tense and filled with an eerie hum, broken only by the occasional flicker of dying lights. The princess, her silver-white hair cascading like liquid starlight over her shoulders, clutched her side. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pressed herself against the cold metal wall, her sharp, violet eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The Galactic Empire's forces would be upon her any second, and she knew her options were running out. She wasn't supposed to be here. Born into a life of privilege and responsibility as the heir to the Empire, she had never known true fear until the rebellion turned its sights on her family. What began as whispers in dark corners had grown into an unstoppable storm, leaving entire sectors in chaos. The ship she was on, a once mighty cruiser of the Empire's fleet, had been commandeered and shot down during an ambush. Now, it was nothing more than a tomb, drifting in the void, and she was trapped inside it, hunted by rebel soldiers who had one mission: ensure the Galactic Emperor's bloodline was extinguished. She winced as a sharp pain flared in her side. Her escape pod had malfunctioned during the crash, leaving her battered and bruised. Her royal guards were gone, and all she had left was a faint glimmer of hope that anyone might come to her aid. But who would dare? Helping the Empire's most valuable asset was a death sentence, and her enemies vastly outnumbered any allies she might have had. That was when she heard it, the faintest sound, a shuffle of movement coming from just around the corner. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prepared for the worst. But instead of the polished boots of a rebel soldier or the gleaming barrel of an energy rifle, she saw something far more peculiar. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in rugged clothing that looked like it belonged in the Stone Age. The man carried a crude spear fashioned from scavenged parts, his expression fierce but cautious. His skin was smeared with dirt and grime, and his unkempt hair gave him a wild, untamed look. Yet there was something in his eyes, a sharpness, a determination that told her he was far from primitive in spirit. The princess stared at him, unsure whether to feel relief or dread. Who are you?" she managed to say, her voice hoarse but steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the corridor, his spear at the ready, before stepping closer. His movements were deliberate, calculated, like a predator assessing its surroundings. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough, carrying a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Not important," he said. "What matters is that you're alive. Let's keep it that way." She blinked, taken aback by his bluntness. "You're not with the rebels." He shook his head. "Not with anyone. Found your ship when it fell out of the sky. Figured there might be survivors. Looks like I was right." Her mind raced as she tried to process the situation. This man, this primitive, as her people might call him, had no allegiance, no stake in the political games of the galaxy. He was an outsider, someone who had no reason to risk his life for her. And yet, here he was, standing between her and certain death. Before she could respond, the distant sound of footsteps echoed through the ship's hollow halls. The rebels were closing in, their voices carrying a deadly certainty. The man stiffened, his grip on the spear tightening. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his intent clear. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, though the pain in her side made every movement agony. "Barely." "Then stay close. I'll get you out of here." Without waiting for her response, he took her arm and guided her down the corridor. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to his rough appearance. The princess couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, even as the danger grew with every passing second. Whoever this man was, he was her only chance. As they moved deeper into the ship, the man's resourcefulness became apparent. He knew how to navigate the crumbling passageways with ease, avoiding patrols and setting crude traps to slow their pursuers. Despite his primitive tools, his instincts were sharp and his every action seemed calculated to ensure their survival. The princess found herself marveling at his ingenuity, though she still couldn't shake the nagging question. Why was he helping her? The princess's heart pounded as she watched the battle unfold, each second stretching into an eternity. She could feel the weight of the moment, the fragile thread upon which their survival hung. And though fear gripped her, a spark of something else began to grow within her, a determination she hadn't felt before. The man locked eyes with her for the briefest moment, his expression fierce and unyielding. "Get to the pods," he growled through gritted teeth. Now, she hesitated, torn between obeying and staying to fight by his side. But the urgency in his voice left no room for argument. With one last glance at the battle raging before her, she turned and ran, her footsteps echoing in the dark corridors as she made her way toward the escape pods. The sound of her own footsteps was drowned out by the pounding of her heart. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, lit only by the flickering emergency lights that cast eerie, shifting shadows on the walls. Every second felt like an eternity as she ran, clutching her side to ease the pain from her injury. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, but she didn't dare slow down. The man's words echoed in her mind. Get to the pods. Now, behind her, the faint roars of the creature and the clash of metal reverberated through the halls. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the battle he was fighting on her behalf. The thought of leaving him behind felt like a weight on her chest, but she forced herself to push forward. He had risked everything to get her this far. The least she could do was make sure it wasn't in vain. The ship groaned and shuddered around her, a harsh reminder of its failing structural integrity. Each tremor sent sparks raining down from exposed wires and loosened panels. The princess bit her lip to stifle a cry of frustration. The path ahead was littered with debris, and navigating it with her injury was becoming increasingly difficult. But she had no choice. Stopping meant death. As she rounded a corner, the corridor opened into another large chamber, a storage area filled with scattered crates and broken machinery. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure of which way to go. Her fingers brushed against the wall, seeking some kind of map or sign to guide her. The emergency lighting was too dim to make out much detail, but a faint hum in the air caught her attention. It wasn't the sound of failing systems or distant combat, it was something else, something alive. Her eyes darted to the shadows at the far end of the room. A soft, clicking noise sent a chill down her spine. She froze, her breath hitching as the sound grew louder. Slowly, she crouched behind a nearby crate, gripping the shard of metal in her trembling hands. The room fell eerily silent for a moment, the only sound her own shallow breathing. And then she saw it, a second hunter, its sleek form emerging from the shadows. It was smaller than the creature she had seen earlier, but no less menacing. Its scaled body glistened in the dim light, and its amber eyes scanned the room with a predatory gleam. The princess held her breath, willing herself to remain perfectly still. Her mind raced as she tried to think of a plan. The man wasn't here to protect her this time. If she made even the slightest noise, she would be on her own against this thing. The creature's head snapped toward her hiding spot, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Her heart skipped a beat, and she clutched the shard tighter, her palms slick with sweat. She had no idea how to fight something like this, but she refused to go down without trying. Slowly, she shifted her weight, preparing to make a desperate dash for the corridor on the other side of the room. Before she could move, the ship lurched violently, throwing her to the ground. The crate she had been hiding behind toppled over with a deafening crash, and the hunter let out a guttural snarl, its gaze locking onto her. There was no time to think, no time to plan. She scrambled to her feet and bolted, her injured side screaming in protest. The hunter let out a piercing screech and gave chase, its claws skittering against the metal floor. The princess ducked and weaved through the maze of crates, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the creature gaining on her, its growls growing louder with each passing second. Desperation fueled her movements, driving her forward even as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. She had to keep going. She couldn't let it end here. She spotted a narrow opening between two stacks of crates and dove through it, her shoulder slamming against the cold metal. The hunter's claws raked against the crates behind her, missing her by inches. She crawled forward, ignoring the pain that shot through her body with each movement. The space was tight, too small for the creature to follow directly, but she knew it wouldn't be deterred for long. Her hands found the edge of the crates, and she pulled herself into the open, gasping for air. She glanced back just in time to see the hunter circling around the obstruction, its movements deliberate and unrelenting. Panic clawed at her chest as she scrambled to her feet. She couldn't outrun it. She needed a weapon, something more effective than the shard of metal in her hand. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. A broken piece of machinery caught her attention, a long cylindrical tube with jagged edges, where it had been torn from its mount. She lunged for it, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy object just as the hunter charged toward her. She swung the makeshift weapon with all her strength, the impact sending a shockwave up her arms as it connected with the creature's head. The hunter recoiled with a furious screech, but it wasn't enough to stop it. It lunged again, its claws slashing toward her. She stumbled back, narrowly avoiding the attack, and swung the tube once more. This time, the jagged edge tore into the creature's side, eliciting a pained howl. The princess didn't stop. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer determination, she struck again and again, each blow pushing the hunter back. But she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The creature was wounded, but far from defeated, and her strength was waning. She needed to end this before it could recover. A sudden idea flashed through her mind. She remembered the exposed wiring she'd seen earlier, the sparking panels hanging loose from the walls. If she could lure the creature close enough, she might be able to use the live wires against it. It was a desperate, dangerous plan, but it was the only chance she had. She backed toward the wall, her eyes never leaving the hunter. The creature snarled, its amber eyes glowing with fury as it stalked toward her. When she reached the sparking wires, she pressed herself against the wall, gripping the tube tightly in both hands. The hunter hesitated, sensing the trap, but its bloodlust overpowered its caution. It lunged forward, claws outstretched, and the princess twisted to the side at the last possible moment. The creature's momentum carried it into the exposed wires, and a blinding arc of electricity surged through its body. It let out a piercing scream, its muscles convulsing as the current coursed through it. The acrid smell of burning flesh filled the air, and the princess turned away, shielding her face from the blinding light. When the sparks finally subsided, the room fell eerily silent. The hunter lay motionless on the floor, its scaled body charred and smoking. The princess stared at it, her chest heaving as the weight of what she had just done began to sink in. She had survived barely, but there was no time to dwell on it. She still had to reach the escape pods, and she still didn't know if the man had made it out alive. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she turned and continued down the corridor, the flickering lights guiding her toward an uncertain fate. The corridor stretched on endlessly, every step feeling like a mile. The princess moved as quickly as her exhausted body would allow, one hand braced against the wall for support. The sparking wires and fallen debris reminded her that the ship's integrity was rapidly deteriorating. Her every instinct screamed that time was running out. The escape pods had to be close, but she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air had shifted, carrying with it a low hum that vibrated through the metal walls. It wasn't the groans of the dying ship or the distant echoes of battle. It was something deeper, unnatural, and it made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She froze, mid-step, straining to listen. The sound was rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat. It was coming from ahead. She tightened her grip on the makeshift weapon, her knuckles white against the cold metal. Cautiously, she pressed on, each step deliberate and measured. The hum grew louder, and with it came a faint glow that illuminated the end of the corridor. The princess hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it another trap? Some kind of shit defense system activating in its final moments? Or something worse? As she drew closer, the glow resolved into a shimmering blue field that stretched across the entire width of the hallway. It pulsed in time with the hum, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. Beyond the field, she could just make out a massive chamber filled with machinery that looked far more advanced than anything she'd seen on the ship so far. It didn't belong here, she realized. It was alien in a way that even the hunters weren't organic and mechanical at once, pulsating as if alive. Her breath hitched as she took a step closer. The air around the field crackled with energy, sending tingles across her skin. Instinctively, she reached out with her free hand, stopping just short of the barrier. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't quite air either. The hum seemed to resonate through her very bones, growing louder the closer she got. Whatever this was, it wasn't just some malfunctioning system. It was deliberate, purposeful. Before she could decide whether to risk stepping through, a voice broke through the silence. It wasn't the deep, commanding tone of the man who had saved her earlier, nor was it the guttural snarls of the hunters. This voice was cold, metallic, and precise, carrying with it an unnerving sense of detachment. Unauthorized entity detected. Termination sequence initiated. Her heart leapt into her throat as a section of the wall behind her slid open with a hiss, revealing a sleek, spider-like drone. Its segmented body gleamed under the flickering lights, and its multiple eyes glowed with the same eerie blue as the field ahead. The princess barely had time to react before it lunged, a thin, needle-like appendage striking where she had just been standing. She stumbled backward, raising the metal pipe in a feeble attempt to defend herself. The drone was faster than anything she had encountered so far, its movements unnervingly fluid. It darted toward her again, and she swung the pipe with all her remaining strength, the impact glancing off its hard shell. Sparks flew, but the drone was undeterred. Desperation surged through her as she backed toward the glowing field. The drone advanced, its appendages clicking menacingly against the floor. Her mind raced for a solution, but there was no time, no room to think. She had to act. Without giving herself a chance to hesitate, she turned and dove through the barrier. The energy field enveloped her, cold and hot at once, sending a jolt through her entire body. She emerged on the other side, stumbling into the massive chamber. The hum was deafening now, and the machinery around her seemed to pulse in time with her own racing heartbeat. The drone didn't follow. Instead, it stopped just short of the barrier, its glowing eyes fixed on her with what almost seemed like curiosity. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it retreated back into the wall, the panel sliding shut behind it. The princess stood frozen, her chest heaving as she tried to process what had just happened. Whatever this chamber was, it was off-limits, even to the ship's own defenses. But why? And more importantly, what was it protecting? Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the strange, organic machinery that seemed to pulse with life. In the center of the chamber stood a massive structure, its surface covered in glowing runes that shifted and changed like liquid. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, even in the archives of her people. It radiated power, an overwhelming presence that made her feel small and insignificant. As she approached, the runes began to glow brighter, and the hum reached a crescendo. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But something compelled her forward, an inexplicable pull that she couldn't ignore. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the surface of the structure. The moment she made contact, the room was flooded with blinding light. Visions flashed before her eyes, memories that weren't her own. She saw planets being consumed by fire, entire civilizations wiped out in an instant. She saw beings of immense power, their forms shrouded in light, standing over the ruins of worlds. And then she saw something else: humans. Not as she knew them now, scattered and struggling to survive, but united, powerful, and terrifying. They stood at the center of it all, their eyes burning with a determination that sent chills down her spine. The light faded, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The structure's glow dimmed, and the hum began to subside. But the images remained burned into her mind, a haunting reminder of what she had just seen. This wasn't just a ship. It was a weapon, a relic of a war long forgotten. And the humans had been at the heart of it. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice, a deep, familiar voice that sent a wave of relief and fear through her in equal measure. The man stepped out from the shadows, his armor battered and his face grim. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his tone heavy with something she couldn't quite place. "Regret? Anger? What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. What did I just see? He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the glowing structure. When he finally spoke, his words sent a chill down her spine. It's the truth, and it changes everything. The princess stared at the man, her chest tightening as the weight of his words sank in. The truth. That's what he called it, but it felt like something far more ominous. The visions still burned in her mind, planets crumbling, countless lives extinguished, and the humans standing at the heart of it all. She wanted answers, but the man's expression made it clear that whatever he was about to say would change everything. "This ship," he began, his voice low and steady, "was never just a weapon. It was a vault, a prison for something far more dangerous than war. The Council feared humanity's potential, so they wiped us out, or so they thought. But they didn't destroy everything. They couldn't. Some of us survived, scattered across the stars, and we've been searching ever since." She shook her head, her mind racing to piece together what he was saying. "Searching for what? What is this place?" He stepped closer to the glowing structure, his hand brushing against its surface as if it were an old friend. "It's not just a relic. It's a key. The Council didn't destroy humanity. They locked us away, erased our history, and buried the truth. They feared what we were capable of, and this ship is proof of that fear. What you saw were echoes of the past, a glimpse of what we once were. But they didn't just seal away our legacy. They sealed away our future." Her heart pounded as the realization dawned on her. "You're saying this ship, it's a way to unlock it? To bring it back?" He nodded, his gaze intense. "Not just bring it back. Rewrite it. We're not just survivors anymore. We're the architects of what comes next. The Council thought they had destroyed us, but they only delayed the inevitable. And now, with this key, we can finish what they started." The princess felt a wave of unease ripple through her. His words were filled with conviction, but there was something else beneath them, an undercurrent of anger, of vengeance that she couldn't ignore. Finish what they started. By doing what? Waging war on the Council. Becoming the very thing they feared? His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might argue. But then he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You don't understand what they did to us. They didn't just take our worlds. They took our identity, our purpose. They turned us into nothing. This isn't about revenge. It's about balance, about making sure no one ever has that kind of power again." She wanted to believe him, but the visions she had seen wouldn't leave her. The destruction, the fire, the unrelenting power, it wasn't balance. It was chaos. And what if you're wrong? What if unleashing this just brings more destruction? More death? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the glowing structure, his hand resting against its surface. The room seemed to grow quieter, the hum fading into an almost imperceptible whisper. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, almost hesitant. "That's a risk I'm willing to take." The words hit her like a blow, and she took a step back, her mind racing. She couldn't let him do this. Whatever was locked away in this ship, whatever power it held, it wasn't meant to be unleashed. The Council might have been wrong to bury the truth, but that didn't mean this was the answer. There had to be another way. She tightened her grip on the metal shard in her hand, her pulse quickening. He was distracted, his focus entirely on the structure. If she acted now, she might be able to stop him. But the thought of raising a weapon against him made her stomach churn. He had saved her life, protected her when he didn't have to. Could she really turn on him now? Before she could decide, The chamber shuddered violently, the machinery around them sparking and groaning. The hum returned, louder and more intense than before, and the glowing runes on the structure began to shift again. The man stepped back, his eyes wide with alarm. "It's activating." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean, activating? I thought you said it was a key." "It is," he said, his voice laced with urgency. "But it's not supposed to activate on its own." "Something's wrong." The room shook again, and a deafening roar filled the air. The structure began to crack, light spilling out from its fractured surface. The princess felt a surge of panic as the visions from earlier flashed through her mind. This wasn't just a key. It was a Pandora's box, and it was about to open. She turned to the man, desperation in her voice. "We have to stop it. If we don't—" Before she could finish, the light intensified, blinding and all-consuming. She shielded her eyes, but the heat and energy radiating from the structure were overwhelming. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, and the chamber fell silent. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the ship. She stood on a barren, desolate plain, the ground cracked and lifeless beneath her feet. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The man stood beside her, his expression one of shock and confusion. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He shook his head, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't know. This shouldn't have happened." A deep, resonant voice echoed around them, cutting through the silence like a blade. It wasn't the man's voice, nor was it anything she had ever heard before. It was ancient and powerful, filled with a chilling sense of finality. "You have unlocked the gates, but you do not understand what lies beyond. The balance you seek is no longer yours to command." The ground beneath them began to quake, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive force. The man reached for her, his expression filled with a rare hint of fear. "We need to leave. Now." But before they could move, the sky erupted with light, and the voice spoke again, this time directly to her. "You hold a choice, child of two worlds. Will you rebuild or destroy?" The weight of the words settled on her like a mountain. The key wasn't his to wield, it was hers. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The Council hadn't feared humanity's strength. They had feared its inability to choose wisely. And now, that choice rested solely with her. The princess stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as the vast weight of the decision settled over her. The barren plain stretched endlessly in every direction, as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for her choice. The man at her side was tense, his eyes searching hers for some kind of answer, but she couldn't offer one. "Not yet." The voice's question reverberated through her mind, deeper than any sound she had ever heard, more profound than anything she had ever felt. Rebuild or destroy? It wasn't just a question, it was a test, and the future of countless lives hinged on her answer. She felt the shard of metal in her hand, its edges biting into her palm as if urging her to act. But how could she decide? How could anyone? The man finally spoke, his voice low but urgent. "Listen to me. Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever this thing is telling you, it doesn't understand what's out there. The Council, the galaxy, they've all moved on. They think we're myths, relics of the past. But this isn't just about humans. This is about everyone who's ever been oppressed, silenced, or erased. If you choose to rebuild, we can give them hope. A chance to rewrite the rules." She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. And if I choose to destroy, his jaw tightened, then you'll prove the Council was right to fear us. You'll turn humanity into the very thing they claimed we were monsters. Her heart pounded as she glanced up at the swirling sky, its stormy expanse reflecting the chaos within her. The voice hadn't given her much to go on, no promises or guarantees, but it had given her the one thing no one else had, agency. This wasn't about him, or the Council, or even humanity. This was about her, and the choice she would have to live with for the rest of her life. The ground trembled again, a reminder that time was slipping away. She turned her gaze back to the man. What happens if I do nothing? If I don't choose? He shook his head, his expression grim. Then the galaxy remains exactly as it is. The Council stays in power, and the truth stays buried. But we'll be trapped here forever. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, the pressure, the weight of his expectations. For a moment, she was back on her home planet, running through the fields as a child, her laughter echoing in the air. She remembered the warmth of her mother's hand, the quiet strength of her father's voice. She remembered the hope she had felt back then, the belief that anything was possible. And she realized that was what had been missing all along. When she opened her eyes, the barren plain seemed less intimidating, the storm less chaotic. She turned to the man, her voice steady. If we're going to rebuild, it has to be for everyone. Not just humans. Not just the Council. Everyone. He blinked, surprise flashing across his face before he nodded slowly. Then let's do it. Together. The glowing structure in the distance pulsed again, but this time it felt less threatening, more alive. She stepped forward, the shard of metal in her hand glowing faintly as she approached the towering monolith. The air around her seemed to hum with energy, as if the universe itself was acknowledging her choice. As she placed the shard into a slot in the structure, a wave of light radiated outward, washing over the plain and stretching far beyond the horizon. The stormy sky began to clear, revealing a vast expanse of stars, brighter and more vivid than she had ever seen. The ground beneath her feet softened, cracks disappearing as life began to stir. Grass sprouted, flowers bloomed, and the air filled with the faint sound of birdsong. The man let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. You did it. But the voice returned, softer this time, almost gentle. The choice has been made, but the work is just beginning. Rebuilding is not an act of power, but of perseverance. Be wise, and the galaxy may yet find peace. The light around them faded, and they found themselves back on the ship, the hum of its engines steady and calm. The man turned to her, a rare smile tugging at his lips. You just rewrote history. No pressure or anything. She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt light, unburdened. But she knew the real challenges were still ahead. Convincing the Council to accept humanity's return, proving that they could be trusted to share power, uniting the fractured galaxy under a common purpose. As they stepped off the ship and back into the wider universe, the man placed a hand on her shoulder. Whatever happens next, we face it together. You and me. She nodded, her resolve firm. Together. The galaxy didn't change overnight. There were battles to fight, alliances to forge, and wounds to heal. But the spark of hope they had ignited began to spread, flickering in the hearts of beings across the stars. Slowly but surely, the old walls began to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding and cooperation. And through it all, the princess and the man stood at the forefront, guiding, inspiring, and reminding everyone that the power to change the world wasn't in destruction, but in unity. The galaxy's future was far from certain, but for the first time in millennia, it was filled with possibility. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all.